It is June 24, 2008. My name is Don Linky. We're here on the campus of Rutgers University in New Brunswick at the Eagleton Institute of Politics. This is another in the continuing series of interviews for the Rutgers program on the Governor and the Brendan T. Byrne Archive. This morning we'll be continuing a session with Sanford Jaffe on his experiences in New Jersey and federal government and his relationship with Governor Brendan Byrne. Sandy, at our last session we discussed some of the major cases that you handled in the Department of Justice during those days, but let's continue from there and talk more generally about your duties in Washington and what you worked on.
Okay. After the spy case, I was asked by the Attorney General, who was then Ramsey Clark, to come down to Washington and work in Washington as a special assistant to the Attorney General, and work with a fellow by the name of Fred Vinson Jr., who was the former Chief Justice's son, and Warren Christopher and Nick Katzenbach, all of whom were then in Justice, and as sort of a roving lawyer or whatever assignments would come in. And I did that, moved with my family to Washington, and I really enjoyed the time in Washington, particularly in the Justice Department. It was a time of great ferment in the country on civil rights issues, and Justice was very much involved in a number of, obviously, in those civil rights issues. And I helped work with Burt Marshall, who was the Attorney General's emissary in Mississippi. And I was also involved to some extent with, I can't remember the name, I think it was Rap Brown, and I've been involved in Maryland, and there were a number of free speech issues that Justice got involved in, and that I...
Rap Brown was the black militant.
Well, right, that I had gotten involved in, and I worked fairly closely. I had a rare opportunity to work closely with Ramsey Clark and Warren Christopher, both of whom were, I think, superb lawyers and extraordinary, decent human beings. And it couldn't be different. Ramsey Clark was a completely different guy than Warren Christopher, who came from a, quote, white shoe law firm in L.A. and then went on, as you know, to become Secretary of State. Very formal fellow, but a very pleasant man. Ramsey Clark, on the other hand, very informal guy, with moccasins all the time, open collar shirts, drove his own car rather than a Justice Department car, and just a very, very easygoing guy. But as far as my experiences were, always coming down on the humanistic side of and the side of the Constitution, no matter what the issues were. So I really enjoyed that. Two other things I did in Justice that I might mention. One was that with a fellow by the name of John Kern, who was then head of the Office of United States Attorneys, and who then went on to become a Court of Appeals judge in the District of Columbia. The two of us created the first really educational program for United States attorneys. The Supreme Court, just about that time, had come down with a landmark decision, Brady versus Maryland, which held that there was a responsibility on the part of the prosecutor to turn over all exculpatory evidence that was in the prosecutorial files so the defendant could have access to it. Well, that kind of, in many ways, really revolutionized the thinking of many of the prosecutors, because it really turned the criminal process into very much an open discovery process, somewhat similar to the civil process. This was difficult for some old-line prosecutors to immediately grasp, and because it was just a different philosophy in how you tried a criminal case. So Ramsey felt, and Fred Vinson did, that it was really important to educate United States attorneys and assistants around the country as to Brady versus Maryland, what the implications were, and what the new philosophy was at Justice. So John Kern and I organized this traveling educational roadshow, and it was very good. Gave me a chance to travel around most of the country, went to a lot of U.S. attorneys' offices, did regional programming, and to me it was an extraordinary learning experience to get a sense as to how prosecutors looked at their responsibilities in different parts of the country, and also to begin the process of really educating them. Met some extraordinary U.S. attorneys. One fellow I'll never forget, a fellow by the name of Cecil Poole, who was U.S. attorney in San Francisco, then went on to become a judge, and a very, very decent guy who I had other occasions to be involved with in other cases in California. So that was one experience which I very much treasure. The other one is sort of an interesting one. Just tell a couple of quick stories because it involves one of my favorite people, and that was Thurgood Marshall, who, as we all know, became the first black United States Supreme Court Justice. Well, sometime when I got down to justice, I don't remember the exact time, Edward Bennett Williams, who was an outstanding criminal defense lawyer, had stumbled on in a case in Las Vegas, stumbled upon the fact that there had been extensive wiretapping by the Federal Bureau of Investigation and eavesdropping, and this has a relationship that eventually becomes very relevant in Brendan's campaign. I mean, it starts back there. And that he had found that the federal FBI had done some wiretapping and some electronic eavesdropping in violation, contravention of federal rules. Well, when that happened, a lot of the Justice Department was thrown into a real turmoil. You know, what do we do? What do we do about it was clear what we were going to do about the future, that none of that could occur without the appropriate safeguards of law. But what do we do about the past? How do we deal with that? You know, thousands of cases all around the country. So the Attorney General and a group of others decided that they would set up a small in-house committee, and the committee was composed of Thurgood Marshall, who was then Solicitor General, a fellow by the name of Mitch Rogovin, who was then head of the tax division, a fellow by the name of Walt Yeagley, who was head of the Internal Security Division, and Fred Vincent, who was head of the Criminal Division. And I was assigned as sort of the staff person, but also as the person who would do a lot of the work for the committee. So what we did is we developed a standard which was later rejected by the United States Supreme Court of we would look through all the old case files, and we would try to determine whether the evidence that was obtained by the wiretaps or the eavesdrops, whether they had a material impact upon the case. And it was arguably, I always forget the phrase, it was arguably relevant that in turn then infected the prosecution that the prosecution would have failed. So with that standard, we would review all these cases, and the committee would meet once a week. And I had just a marvelous, opportunity to get to know Thurgood Marshall, and a man with a great sense of humor and great insight. And I'll just tell you two funny incidents, the serious ones at this point you don't need to hear. But one day, phone rings, and I pick it up, and it's the justice's, the solicitor's wife, and I tell Thurgood the phone's there, and he gets on the phone. He's talking to his wife, and he goes on a series of numbers, 21, 75, 65, and so and so. And I said, he hangs up the phone, and I said to him, it's an odd conversation with your wife about numbers. He looked at me, he said, Sandy, he said, with all this wiretapping going on, you don't think I'm going to tell her what I want to tell her? Well, I'm going to meet her at a certain point prearranged. It was just so funny. And then one other incident that in those days, for reasons unbeknown to myself, I used to smoke cigars. I didn't inhale, but I smoked them. And we were saying everybody could smoke in those days, long before the anti-smoking rules. So one day we're sitting there, and I take out one of my cigars. Somebody else had taken a cigar out, so I took out mine, and I couldn't light it. So Mitch Rigovan gives me his lighter to light the cigar, and I keep trying, and he can't work it. And Mitch says, "I'll try it." He can't work it. So Thurgood looks and said, "Give it to me," and give it to the Solicitor General. One flip, the light goes on. He turns and he said, "They say black men are not very good with machinery." So we all. So anyway, it was just a rare opportunity to work with him, to discuss legal issues with him at those meetings, and I really got to know him well enough that I felt very comfortable stopping up his office and chatting with him when I thought I had a problem that I wanted his advice on, which he was always. And I'll tell you one other really quick story, one other Thurgood story. Sure. He told this story about when he was general counsel to the NAACP, which he was for a long time, and in fact had argued Brown versus the Board of Education, landmark education case in this country, before the Supreme Court. So he tells the story that he's in his office one day at the NAACP, and he gets a phone call, and it's really late. And the phone call is from a fellow who works at the NAACP in the maintenance department. And the fellow calls and tells Thurgood that he's just been arrested on some minor charge and he's in jail. And could Thurgood come and get him out of jail? So Thurgood would obviously do that. So he goes and he tells the story, and he gets the fellow out of jail. So the next day, he tells the fellow to come and talk to him in the office and handle this case. So the fellow comes into his office and he tells him, "Well, I'm going to take your case, and I'll go down to the magistrate's court for you and all that." And the gentleman is very shy. He tells the story better. And he's kind of looked down on the floor and kind of awkward and all that. And finally, he blurts out, Mr. Marshall, I really don't want you to handle my case." Well, Thurgood is absolutely nonplussed by this. Why the fellow want to handle this case? He's argued Brown. He said, "Why? Why don't you want to handle it?" He said, "I just want to get out. I want to go free. I don't want to be a test case." I always liked that story. Anyway, so there were other things. One of the things I liked, I then also worked extensively on what became the first Safe Streets Act, which became the Law Enforcement Assistance Act. Instead of that whole grant program, I worked on helping set out. And then I had a really interesting job, which was I was appointed to a committee by the Attorney General of an interagency committee with the Pentagon and Department of Defense and others on the use of the polygraph in governmental investigations. And I sat on that committee and ended up writing a dissent. They justified the use of polygraph, and I was opposed to it. My policy did not become federal policy. Anyway, that sort of kind of sums up justice, and obviously, I stayed there, as I mentioned before, until the riots, the civil disorders in Newark and Detroit, and I went up to run the Riot Commission.
Now, when you came up to run the Riot Commission investigation, did you move up temporarily, or did you think that was the end of your Washington tenure at that point?
No, I really thought it was the end for a couple of reasons. One was I had the sense, when I traveled around the country and I also came back to New Jersey, that the Democrats were not going to win. Mm-hmm. This was the end of Vietnam, and that I thought the Democrats were not going to win, and obviously I was an appointee in justice, and so I wouldn't stay there. And I also assumed that the people I liked to work with, like Ramsey Clark and Warren Christopher and Nick Katzenbach, would be gone. So I wouldn't want to stay in justice even if I could. And the second reason was that I figured that it was time to sort of come back to New Jersey. This is where my family roots were. It's where my family was. This is where my wife's family was in this area, and also I didn't really want to live in Washington permanently. It was not the kind of place I really wanted to live in, and I figured that it would be time for me to move back probably into the legal profession, and that after I did the Riot Commission report, I would probably want to go to a law firm and practice law and do the various things, and I figured it was time really to move into that sector at this point and see what would happen politically in the state, where I felt I'd have a better chance of doing more interesting public service. Mm-hmm. So I did come up with the idea of staying up here.
Mm-hmm. Now that you've been in government and roles both in the Department of Justice and the Commission, what did you see as your career options for the next step?
Well, as somebody once said when I got introduced before I think the Rhode Island Bar Association to make a speech, and I gave the fellow my resume, he said, "This is obviously a gentleman who couldn't hold a job." I think I had a 10 or 11 of them. But anyway, I have never been very hesitant about doing something different than I had done before. I guess a lot of it was luck, that something would come up that I really thought I wanted to do, and I was willing to take the risk, usually, that would come about doing something new and different. So I kind of thought that after the Riot Commission, something would happen, and I kind of thought about the law firm, and I think, as I mentioned before, I had been offered a partnership in the Lowenstein law firm before that, and then I decided, so I figured that would still be open, even though Alan Lowenstein was a little annoyed at me. So I figured if not that, there were a lot of other law firms. I knew a lot of people in New Jersey, so I really wasn't concerned about it. And I think I mentioned that Dick Hughes had made that kind offer that I could remain as his assistant or something on the payroll until I found a job. But near the end of the Riot Commission, I did go see Alan, and I did get offered again to come back to the Lowenstein firm, and that was really a first-class law firm. So, and people there who I knew and liked, and so I would have gone there. But then I got a phone call. One of the colleagues on my who worked with me, Bob Goldman, who I'd mentioned, who was the deputy. Bob was a close friend of a fellow by the name of Mike Sverdoff, who was then appointed vice president at the Ford Foundation. McGeorge Bundy had just become president near the end of the Johnson administration, and he be president of Ford. And Mike had been the head of human services for John Lindsay for about a year or so. Anyway, Bob was a good friend of Mike's, and he was going to go to Ford. And so Bob Goldman mentioned my name to Mike Sverdoff, and Mike in turn mentioned my name to McGeorge Bundy, and I got a phone call one day saying that I'd like to come in for an interview. And I said sure, not knowing very much about the Ford Foundation. And I went in and chatted with Mike, and then chatted with Bundy. And within a week or so, if I remember, I got offered a job there. And that was the tough decision, in a way, because up until then, everything I had done, except for the Riot Commission, had been law-related. Although I had not been in private practice for only a couple of months, it still was involving the law and trying cases or doing policy issues in law. And I had never been a part of the philanthropic world and knew almost absolutely nothing about it. Never applied for a grant. The only thing I knew about is the little work I had done on the Safe Streets Act and the Law Enforcement Assistance Act. So I kind of thought about that and discussed it with my family and my wife and kids and a whole bunch of friends of mine, and I remember even talking to Brendan about that, and decided that, well, I was going to do it. It was different, and a fellow who was very instrumental and also influenced me a lot was Paul Ivesacker, who had worked for Dick Hughes as Commissioner of Community Affairs and also had been at Ford years ago. And Paul, I remember one day telling me, you know, you don't know much about New York and you don't know much about the world. And he said, you go to Ford, you'll learn a lot about New York, and you'll learn a lot about the world. And you'll learn a lot about different social issues and policy questions that face many different parts of the world and face many different parts of the United States. And he said it'll be an extraordinarily broadening experience for you. He said you can always practice law, which is probably not accurate, but I wanted to believe that. So I decided that I would go to Ford, even though, as I said, I had no experience and no real knowledge about what philanthropy was all about or what I would even do there.
Well, describe briefly the Ford Foundation's mission and
Sure.
Major initiatives during those days.
Well, it was an extraordinarily exciting place to work in for a couple of reasons. As I said, Bundy had taken over what had been a fairly dormant organization, been run by John J. McCloy, who was then chairman of the board of Ford. He had been the former commissioner of Germany after the Second World War, and you know, part of the real Eastern establishment. And a fellow by the name of Henry Heald was the president, and I think he had been the president of one of the major universities before that. But it was kind of a dark, kind of a stodgy place. Most of its grants were to universities, to major research facilities, and it did some work overseas. There were allegations that Ford had ties to the CIA, had a number of overseas organizations, and it was really a very dormant place. Well, Bundy came in with a real mission to really attack the social issues that were facing America in the late 60s and 70s. He was committed to civil rights, he was committed to poverty issues, he was committed to improving educational opportunities, and he was really committed to working overseas, but in underdeveloped societies in third world countries, and building that infrastructure and building an academic infrastructure in those kinds of countries. So with that in mind, he went out and hired a staff, maybe 35, 40 people, who he thought could implement that kind of vision. So, for example, the fellow who was a vice president for national affairs, Mike Swerdoff, was a guy who had never gone to college. He had after high school, he went out, worked in the auto plants, and had been a major organizer for Walter Reuther in the UAW, United Auto Workers, and then went to New Haven and became chair of the school board and one of the first gray areas projects, and then went to Lindsay. And Bundy had the courage to hire a guy like that without a college degree. But Mike had a great sense of what social policy issues were, and he knew how to implement a program. He had run things. So he was looking for guys who would not only be able to theorize and conceptualize what a program would look like, but would also be able to help implement it. So, his other appointees, nobody else on that, no other vice president had Mike's background. There was a fellow by the name of David Bell, who had been a former head of aid in the Johnson administration, and there was Howard Howe, who had been the commissioner of education in the Johnson administration, who was an extraordinary, decent person who understood a lot about education. He was hired. So it was a fairly broad representative group. So I kind of quickly, although it was an environment I was not particularly used to, in the sense that there were a lot of people from a different echelon of society than I had generally been involved with, although not necessarily. Anyway, I easily felt fairly comfortable there, and I was lucky in the sense that I got to be the head of the government and law program at Ford, which was a fairly major program. In those days, we were responsible for, I would say, something around 18 or 19, 15 to 18 million dollars a year in grants, which was pretty sizable in those days. And so I began to understand what the world of philanthropy was like. I began to understand what it was to make grants, and I began to understand how to fit the grant making into the broader visions of the foundation and social policy. So, if you want, I can chat a little bit about some of the major programs that we...
Yeah, why don't you do that? No, and also, what's specifically, if anything, related to New Jersey?
Well, one of the major programs that I was responsible for was the development of public interest law. And I led the Foundation's initiative to create around the country 8 or 9 major public interest law firms that would represent the underrepresented in a wide variety of areas. Working with colleagues in the education part of Ford, I funded, with colleagues, the Education Law Center in New Jersey. And Paul Trachtenberg, who was then the first director or first chair of the board, how I got to know Paul, came in and we made a grant to them. And they became very instrumental in New Jersey and Robinson versus Cahill and much of the litigation following that. So one of the grantees that we set up during the public interest law firm had a major impact in New Jersey in the context of the Education Law Center. Obviously, a lot of the other grantees, a lot of their work they would do in the consumer area and the women's rights area. We also set up the Women's Rights Project in Washington, a mental health law project. A lot of those had offshoots or had impacted things in New Jersey. I also think one of the, I'm going on too long, let me know. One of the also things that I think it also laid the groundwork with Brendan for the creation of the Public Advocate's Office in New Jersey, because the Public Advocate's Office was a state-run public interest law firm, basically, and Stan Van Ness, whom we all know, became the first director of it. And Brendan got the idea, with my conversations with others, etc. But it was really modeled after the public interest law firms that we were funding at the Ford Foundation. And the Public Advocate's Office, I think, was one of very, very significant initiatives in the governor's tenure. So that I always saw that as a really major social program that I had been involved in. I was also involved in the creation and the support of criminal justice centers around the country. There are probably 10 or 12 major criminal justice research centers. There's one at Rutgers, there's one at NYU, in Chicago, California, Harvard, all of which were Ford funded at some point in their existence. And that was also within my portfolio and the kinds of things that I did. So that was, I look on that as a major accomplishment. I also did a lot of work with Eagleton and gave very early grants to Alan Rosenthal, who was then the director of Eagleton, because we had a small program, but a significant program on improving state legislators. And Alan was, and Eagleton was in the forefront of that. And we also made the first grant to the Center for American Women in Politics. That was a Ford-sponsored thing, and that was one of my first grants here. So it had a lot of influence.
So we owe quite a bit to the Ford Foundation.
It did have. Well, I try to never forget that I came from New Jersey, and I also had that New Jersey experience.
Well, during these early years with the Ford Foundation, before he declares as a candidate for governor,
right,
in 1973, what contacts, if any, did you have with Brendan Burns?
You know, not a lot, but I remember, you know, on occasion I would call Brendan. On occasion we sometimes would have a meal together and chat. I think Brendan came into Ford one day, but I can't recall. I think he came in one day with Governor Hughes. When the governor left the governor's office, he got very active in corrections issue, and he became chair of a commission, the Presidential Commission on Corrections. And Hughes came in to get funding from Ford, which we eventually did give him. And I remember having lunch with Hughes, and I thought Brendan was there, but I'm not really sure about that lending support to it. And one other quick thing at Ford before we get on, I would be remiss, is the work we did in dispute resolution, which I'm really quite pleased of, which really the beginnings of much of I think a lot of what's happened in the country on dispute resolution, much of which goes back to a conference in the 1990s in St. Paul, Minnesota, run by Chief Justice Warren Burger, and Ford and I played a role in forming that conference and supporting it, and that laid the groundwork for a lot of work in dispute resolution after that. But let's get back to Brendan. Otherwise, I'll go on for the rest of the day.
Well, that's okay. Well, let's move to time around 1973. Governor Cahill is in office, but has run into some political problems with scandals in the administration and opposition from the conservative factions of his party and for some of his initiatives. How did you sort of view the political situation in New Jersey at that time, just prior to Brendan Byrne's decision to declare as a candidate?
I remember after the Riot Commission, Bob Miner tried to run again. I think that was in '68, all right? And I remember being very supportive. I liked Governor Miner a lot and being supportive of him. And I remember going around and making a couple of speeches on his behalf. But that campaign never really went anywhere, as I think. It had been Miner's time, and that had really passed. And then as I said, I was in New York, and I really was not very active in local politics. I'd see Brendan on occasion, but Brendan was not active. He was still a judge at that point, and there was very little conversation about Brendan running for governor. And frankly, I don't even remember who else was being talked about for governor at that point. So I played kind of a quiet role in New Jersey politics at that time.
Do you remember any prior talk of Brendan Byrne challenging Senator Williams for renomination, given the problems that Senator Williams had encountered?
No, I don't. No conversations that I really had with Brendan. I don't really become active in the campaign until Brendan announces he's going to run. And what I was kidding before, but the irony of having worked on the wiretap stuff way back in Justice when I was with the Justice Department, that one of the keys, I think, to Brendan's campaign was the disclosure in the wiretaps. I forget the name of the case, that two guys talking about the fact that Brendan Byrne, the prosecutor, can't be bought. You remember that?
Yeah, I think that was the DeCalvacanti.
That's right. That was a major item. So there was, not that was a cause and effect, but it was really kind of ironic. And then I remember now when Brendan decides that he's going to run, I offer my services to Brendan. And whatever I could do. I remember being active in writing position papers. I think I did one or two speeches for him, but not a lot. I think most of the stuff I did was position papers, and I would be involved. He would have meetings of the people who were helping him. Maybe 8 or 9 of us, I gather, he thought were key people up in his house in West Orange, and I would go to a number of those and usually have disagreements with some of his staff. I mean, one of the major issues I remember is that this was a time that people were kind of very unhappy about the crime, and there was a big movement for mandatory sentencing. And couple of people on Brendan's staff, campaign staff wanted him to come out for mandatory sentencing as a major issue in the campaign. And I remember going up at the House and arguing that he shouldn't, on the grounds that, you know, he had been a judge. He knew how important it was to have flexibility, and mandatory sentences weren't anything anyway. And then somebody said to him, well, you know, all the polls, I'll never forget this one, all the polls are showing how important this is. So he looked at Brendan in his typical way. He said, look, if I went by the polls, all the people would probably be happy to vote out the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, which was very accurate at that point. So, I mean, I would get in these kinds of discussions with Brendan during the campaign, which was a very interesting and exciting time to be part of. And I remember the night that he won, he had his headquarters was in the hotel in West Orange. I forget the name of the hotel.
Mayfair? Mayfair?
No, it wasn't Mayfair. I think
Okay.
it was something like one of those up there. And when the returns started coming in, and being in a little room with him, and all of a sudden it was really clear that he was going to win, and all of a sudden 3 state police come in and form a court. Right, all of a sudden he had that, and it was an extraordinary, exciting moment to see his face and his figuring that he had won. And he said, now what are we going to do? So, anyway.
Now that he's elected, did you consider joining the administration?
Yeah, I did consider joining. You know, I had been at Ford just a couple of years, and I really liked what I was doing, and I really thought that what I was doing at Ford was really socially useful and important. And I thought working in that environment with Bundy was a rare opportunity. Fred Friendly was there. We were creating, at that point, public broadcasting. So, I mean, all kinds of very exciting initiatives were going on at Ford. So I talked with Brendan, and Brendan offered me the Commissioner of Environmental Protection. And, you know, I kind of thought about it really hard. Again, knowing very little about environmental issues at that point, but not knowing anything didn't really stop me. My father had once told me as a kid, he said, you know, my father was an immigrant to this country. He said, you know, in America, he said, you never turn down a job on the grounds you don't know how to do it. Unless, he said, what you're going to do is going to hurt people, like building a bridge.
Of course, at that time, not too many people knew much about the environment.
Very much right. In fact, the fellow Brendan hired was a fellow from Israel.
Dave Bardeen.
David Bardeen. And, you know, I talked to Brendan about it, and I just didn't really want to leave Ford. I kind of want to work. I think the one job that I would have taken, Brendan didn't want to offer me, and that was Attorney General. I would have. I've told that to Brendan. He knows that. But he made a great choice in
Bill Hyland.
In Bill Hyland. But I think that job I would have left Ford for. But that was not. And then Brendan asked me a little later on if I wanted to be chairman of the Casino Control Commission. But again, I didn't see myself going to Atlantic City all the time.
In retrospect, probably a good choice.
A good choice, right. I might have then gone to private practice 5 years later and made a lot of money representing casinos. But I remember sitting with Brendan in Morven and talking about that because he was really concerned about, there had been some allegations about one of the people on the Casino Control Commission, allegations which were absolutely not accurate, but that created some problems, and so he wanted somebody else new, and he figured, well, yeah, he thought that I might be interested in it. But Brendan was, you know, it never harmed our friendship.
Mm-hmm.
You know, my saying to Brendan, look, that's just not something I think I want to do. He said fine, he understood that, and we would meet occasionally and have dinner, and Brendan at one point had an issue, and I can't remember what the issue was, and he wanted to talk to a fellow I knew in New York who was an extraordinarily sophisticated lawyer. It had nothing to do, it was something which I can't remember what it was. And Brendan asked me if, you know, I could set up a meeting with this fellow whom I know, had been a former deputy attorney general in one of the administrations. And we did that. One night we had dinner. So we continued our friendship. We continued talking, et cetera, and so forth. But I didn't go work in the administration. And then one day, am I going on too long?
Okay.
One day, Brendan calls and says, I'm going to do something which I know you'll take. I said, what's that? He said, I'm going to give you an opportunity to serve on the same board with Joe Weintraub, the former Chief Justice. Joe Weintraub was on the Rutgers Board of Governors. And he says, I'm going to appoint you to the Rutgers Board of Governors. I think the governor has 6 appointees. There are 11 members, and 5 come from the trustees. And so he said, I'm going to appoint you to the Rutgers Board of Governors, and you'll have an opportunity to sit with Joe Weintraub. Well, obviously. Well, first place, it was a great opportunity to be on Rutgers' board, but the thing that really swayed me, not that I needed any swaying, was the opportunity to sit on the same board with Joe Weintraub, who I had been a law clerk to. I mean, it was really one of those twists. It's like when I was at Ford, I had been a student of Al Sachs, professor at Harvard Law School, and sat, in the back of the board is getting called on. And then at Ford, I made a grant to Harvard on something, and I went up and Al Sachs invited me to dinner with a bunch of the faculty. And I remember telling him, I said, it was a little different than becoming a student here. So that was a rare opportunity, and I did clearly, obviously, accept that appointment.
Did you have any perception of how Joe Weintraub viewed sitting equally with you?
I think, the sad thing about it was, Brendan told me that Joe was really pleased by that. I mean, I think I've mentioned to you, I kind of sensed he liked me, even though he thought I was a little bit eccentric on times. But unfortunately, he died. He was in Florida, and he had, I think, some kidney problems. And Brendan always felt that. It was very sad, because Brendan felt that had he been here in New Jersey, he would have gotten the kind of treatment that would have made a difference. That I don't know. But he died before I actually, by the time my appointment got through the appointing process and all, so I never got a chance to actually sit with him.
And of course, the Byrne administration, after a strong start in its early months, runs into political problems, perhaps indirectly caused by your funding of Paul Trachtenberg.
Right, the Education Law Center, right. And the Public Advocate, which also has suing people, right.
In the Robinson v. Cahill decision, and the administration's initial failures to comply with the Supreme Court order by passing a comprehensive tax and school reform proposal. What was your view from the outside as the governor is facing the political issues and the fiscal problems that were created?
Yeah, from what I saw, I think Brendan took a very principled stand. As you know, he was the first governor to enact the income tax, really. Of course, Governor Hughes, who was then Supreme Court Justice, had to threaten to close the schools and not open them up, I gather. But, my experiences with Brendan, that he would take the principled stand. I mean, Brendan understood politics. There's no question about that. His father had been West Orange, I think, councilman. He'd been brought up in a political family, and he understood politics. But I think within Brendan, where that streak of, if it became an issue of principle, that was really going to be important to him. And that's a sense I had. And as you know, that's after he did that OTB became the famous slogan, one term burn. Of course, he also had, I think it's an example of a principled stand really worked in New Jersey. And he had the good fortune of running against a fellow who was not particularly politically savvy at that point. And I think that too helped.
As the polls show Governor Byrne's popularity plummeting toward his re-election, what was your personal view as to whether he should stand for re-election?
I was not one of the key people that I know that really talked him into. I think Barry was and others were, but I thought he should. I mean, I thought that he had done a really good job. There were a number of initiatives that he had undertaken. But it was a very principled stand he was taking on the income tax and the school issue. et cetera, and et cetera. And Brendan also was a guy, which was really important in New Jersey. There was never a hint of corruption.
Mm-hmm.
There was never a sense that there was any corruption that Brendan or his administration was really a part of. So I think it was important for him to stand for re-election.
And during his re-election campaign, you're still on the Rutgers Board of
Right.
Governors. So
Right.
did you feel constrained of being politically active because?
You know, a little bit. But, you know, I was never, I was never a major fundraiser. That was not the world I traveled in. So, and I would, and I'd go to, the dinners that I could go to that I thought was appropriate to go and be a part of discussions. The fact that I was on a Rutgers board, I didn't see that as any what do you call it, conflict. I mean, in fact, one of the Rutgers missions is to do public service. Part of public service is helping think through some of these policy issues.
Were you surprised when he did win the
Not really.
1977 election?
Not really, and I'll tell you why. One of the guys on the Rutgers board was a fellow named Sonny Werblin, who a lot of people in this state know, because Sonny was I can't pronounce the word.
Paris
of real high order. And Sonny had owned the New York Jets, and then he was head of Madison Square Garden, and he had done, you name it, in the entertainment world. Sonny Werblin had done it, but he's also an extraordinarily shrewd guy. And at one point, I think Sonny was it Bateman who ran against? Right. He was a supporter of Bateman at one point. In fact, one day Sonny told me, way in the beginning of the campaign, because I got to know Sonny from the Rutgers board and really liked him a lot. And he would invite me and my kids to Madison Square Garden. We'd see hockey games and circuses and that kind of thing. Anyway, Sonny told me that the best Bateman would win this election if he went to the Bahamas for 8 months and just didn't show up. That was in the beginning of the campaign. He said he'll do nothing but hurt himself on the way down. Although Bateman is a very decent guy, but I gather didn't run a really very good campaign on his tax business and all. Anyway, Sonny told me, I remember at one board meeting about a month before the election, he said, "Brendan's going to win this." He said, "I'm telling you, I really picked this up. He's going to make a dramatic recovery. Nobody's going to expect him to win, and he will." And and he did. I want to tell you one other, if I can.
Sure.
I know Bob's coming. One other. I don't know if I told you this Brendan story, but to me, it's a funny one. It takes us a little off the policy part, but gives you some insight into Brendan. Did I tell the story about Brendan going with me to Florence?
No.
Okay. Well, when I was at one of the things, did the criminal justice stuff at Florence, and there was a conference in Florence run by the European University, which is one of our grantees, and it was a kind of a worldwide conference on the latest issues and corrections and criminal justice issues, etc. And so I remember talking to Brendan, telling him about this meeting, and said, there are going to be some really good people, really good scholars from around the world, and some others. Attorney General of Italy's coming, people who I think you'd like to meet, and it would be interesting to pick up some ideas. Do you want to come? So I said, yeah, he'll come. So Brendan and his wife came with me and my wife. So we travel circuitous route, which I won't bore you with, but we finally get to Florence. And we stay in a fairly small but very nice hotel, but not a very small one. And the fellow who was running, the man who was running this conference is Professor Mario Capoletti, who was both a professor at Stanford and also a professor at the European University. So he had given a sheet. It's a little long story, if you don't mind. He had given a sheet in which he said, if you want to go, the conference was in Fiesole, which is a small town up in the hills of Florence. And he said there's a bus, but if you want to take a cab, you should take a cab, and the fare should be something like 2,500 lira. I mean, 2,500 lira. Not a lot of money, even in those days, before the... So Brendan and I, are going to go up to the conference. And I think Brendan has with him a little satchel, which I said to him, "Why are you carrying this satchel up there?" And he said, those were a bunch of favors, Atlantic City chips, pens. I said, none of these people are going to want that. I looked at him. He said, you wait. In fact, when we got to the conference and Brendan gets introduced, he said, oh, by the way, I have it. He opens it up and everybody dives to take all the pens and everything else. Anyway, so we get in the cab, and Brendan said to me, in my really half-hearted Italian, they asked this fellow how much it's going to cost. And he says that it's going to cost 5,000 lira instead of 2,500, which is not a lot of money. Brendan said, let's not do it. Let's not take this cab. The guy's trying to hold this up. I said, we want to get there and all that. He said, no, we're not going to take this cab. So started to get out of the cab. So the guy turns to me, and he said, you got to give me 3,000 lira for waiting for you. Okay? So I said, Brendan said, don't pay him. That's not right to pay the guy. I said, I'm not going to pay you. Brendan does. So we're going back and forth. And I'm telling Brendan, let's pay him. And no, don't pay him. I said, all right. So by this time, the guy is gesturing all over the place, and a crowd gathers. And we're about 2 blocks from the Arno River. And the crowd's getting bigger and bigger in this conversation. I'm trying to tell the guy no, and the guy's telling me yes, and Brendan's telling me to do it. Anyway, pretty soon the crowd, I say, the guy says, we're going to the police. And I say, yes, bullets at the police. And I knew that down at the Arno River, there was one policeman who was directing traffic. So Brendan, myself, the cab driver, and this crowd go marching down to the Arno River. So we get down to the river, and now the crowd's really getting bigger. The police guy sees all this coming, he can't figure it all out. So the policeman tries to intercede, and the conversation's going back and forth with the cab driver, much of which I don't understand. And Brendan doesn't understand, he doesn't speak Italian. So finally, the police guy said to me that you have to pay him. Otherwise, you're going to go to court. So Brendan said, I'll never forget that, he said, well, we should do it to give us a chance to see the criminal justice system firsthand. I said to Brendan, I don't think we want to go through that. I said, they don't have the right of counsel here and the right to bail. I said, I don't think we want to do that. So with that, he laughs, and I told the police guy, we're going to pay him. So I go into my wallet, and I take out 3 1,000 liras. They were in paper at that point. So I give the guy the 3,000 lira. So the taxi cab driver holds it up like this, the crowd roaring in approval. And then with a grand gesture, he takes it and rips up the money and throws it up in the air. Anyway, it was one of those great times, and the crowd disperses. The police guy, the guy feels good. And I turned to Brendan, I said, how do we get the Fiozza now? He said, we look for a cab. I said, what if we find the same guy? Anyway, we did finally get there. It was one of my better stories with Brendan.
Let's take a short break.
Okay.
You can stay there. Not too many people do that.
Yeah, I feel bad.
I'm rolling.
Sandy, before we broke, you talked about your trip to Florence with Mr. and Mrs. Byrne.
Right.
Let's move on a little bit. He does get reelected in 1977. You said that you really weren't surprised because of the conversations you had with Sonny Werblin, among other things. During the second term, how did you see Brendan Byrne as governor and the accomplishments of his second term administration?
Yeah. I think, my recollection is that Brendan really matures in the second term. I think that he really feels, my recollection is that he really feels comfortable in the job. He enjoys very much being governor. I think he enjoys very much the politics of it. I think it was an extraordinary he got a really great feeling by being reelected. I mean, to have gone through what he did, and everyone most people having written him off, and to have won that gives him a tremendous shot of confidence. And I think, very, very good feelings. And so I think the second term, from my meetings with Brendan, is a more mature, very comfortable governor, a very comfortable politician. and someone who really is going to try to do the things that have been left undone.
Now, let me shift a little bit to your role on the Rutgers Board of Governors.
Sure.
Discuss a bit the issues that were facing Rutgers then and the perspective you had on Rutgers as the state university.
Yeah. Well, as I said, I really enjoyed being on the board. It was a really good time. It was a good time to be on the board. Ed Blaustein was an excellent president and a guy very much committed to Rutgers and a very bright and capable person. And the board had an unusually good combination of people. It was Sonny Werblin, brought that entertainment world. It was a fellow by name was Maury Tannenbaum, who was then president of AT&T, who had a very broad international perspective. There was somebody, I forget, who was president of one of the largest banks in New Jersey, who was on the board. It was my colleague who's now co-director with me at the Center for Negotiation, Linda Stamato, was a trustee member who brought also brought a different view to the board. A labor union official who was head of the, I think it was the Garment Workers Union at that point, or a vice president of the Garment Workers Union. Senator Bob Torselli, who was the youngest member of the board. Catherine White, who had been the first female ambassador to any country appointed by FDR to the Netherlands. She was on the board. So we had a very, very good, very dedicated group of people. And I really enjoyed working on the board. And there were some really interesting issues in that time. For example, one of the things not one of the policy issues, but an important issue, was that Brendan was influential and was in Rutgers creating the Office of Legal Counsel. Up until that time, we had always farmed out all the legal work. And one day Brendan called me up and said, by the way, he said, I don't know much about that budget. It's huge. I can't figure that one out, but I can look at the legal budget. And you guys are spending a lot of money on outside counsel. Do you think it's time? And I agree with them. I think it is time for us to hire and have our in-house counsel and talk with Ed. Brendan talked with Ed about it, and that became then an issue that the board finally did agree. And I think that's was a significant, not necessarily policy issue, but a structural issue that became important for the university. There were a number of really exciting issues that we had, and important ones. For example, the whole question of South African divestments came up in that time. There was a move afoot in the country for educational institutions and other corporations to divest of their stock holdings in South Africa on the grounds that that was supporting a very apartheid government, which was contrary to all the democratic principles we believed in. And so that came to the Rutgers board, and we had long discussions and a lot of issues back and forth. And then finally the university voted to divest itself of South African of companies who were investing in South Africa. One of the other issues that came before the board, which has had a tremendous influence on the university, was the question of consolidating, making the colleges into one college of arts and science. Prior to, I don't remember exactly the year, but obviously sometime in the 70s, Rutgers had a series of colleges, Douglas, Livingston, Rutgers College, and so forth. Each one had its own faculty, and each one was run by a dean with its own faculty. The board, and Ed thought, primarily Ed then led the board, felt very strongly that the time had come to have one faculty, a faculty of arts and sciences, because it was very difficult to go out and hire first-class economists or first-class political scientists if they were limited to a small college. And I thought this was the wave of the future. And that was a very long and very involved set of conversations at the board, and finally the board did move to do that. And only last year, no, 2 years ago, the final stages in that were finally taken over. But that was a very significant thing, and remember that took a lot. We had issues such as there was a lot of pressure from members of the legislature for Rutgers to create a night law school, and that was something the board resisted. And resisted it not only because they thought it was not practical at that point, but I think there was a real questions of academic integrity. There was this very, very tenuous role between what a legislature wants to tell you and what a board really is pointed to preserve the integrity of the institution. So that issue also encompassed a lot of time. And one of the other issues, among others, was the question of whether or not Rutgers should go into big-time football. Up until, I guess sometime again in the 70s, I don't remember the year, as you probably know, Don, Rutgers played Princeton and Lehigh and Lafayette and played in a very different league. And sometimes did very well. Where 1 or 2 seasons they went undefeated, in fact, and that did very well. Well, for many, many reasons, which I won't go, and Bob McKay will do a more thorough job than I will. The issue came before the board. Was it time to go big time and begin the gradual move to the real serious Division I football team and begin to change the schedule, move away from the Princeton, Lehigh, and Lafayette, and that kind of schedule. And that was a big set of discussions also at the board. And I think one of the other issues that I got very involved in with Joe Whiteside, who was one of the finest individuals on the Rutgers staff. He was the vice president and treasurer, and Joe was very, very instrumental in beginning the whole expansion of the university. Up until the 70s, the place was a fairly small university. And I remember specifically the Rutgers basketball team was a very good basketball team 1 or 2 years there. In fact, 1 year they even went to the Final Four. And I went up to see Rutgers was playing in the NCAA quarterfinals or something like that up in Hartford, Connecticut. And I went there with one of my sons, Greg, who was going to Wesleyan at that time. And I had gotten up there, I forgot how, but I needed a ride home. So I rode home with Ed Blaustein and Joe Whiteside. And the three of us rode home after the basketball game the next morning. And we started a conversation about what Rutgers really needed in terms of funds and the role that bond issues could play in beginning to really expand the university and do a lot of the building and expansion that had not taken place. And from that conversation, Joe developed a long-range plan for the university, which the president approved, which then went to the board, and the board adopted it. And that began, I think, one of the major expansions of the university. So, you know, there were, I've given you the highlights of some of the issues, but it was a very, very interesting job, and not a job, well, it became almost a job. Theoretically, supposed to be an application.
During one of his interview sessions, Governor Byrne recalled that Ed Blaustein, during the 1977 election campaign, was quoted saying something that it wouldn't matter to Rutgers whether Senator Bateman or Governor Byrne was elected in November 1977, and that Governor Byrne felt that that was not a reasonable position.
Yeah.
Do you recall that and any discussions with Governor
You know, I
Byrne
really
about that?
don't. But my own opinion, it was not appropriate. The president of Rutgers ought not to involve himself or herself into that kind of political world. I mean, I think it's perfectly appropriate for the president of Rutgers, and I think it's mandated, to take positions on social issues and policy questions. I think university presidents should do. They have a bully pulpit, which they should use. But on the politics of it, no. Even if In fact, we're state funded, and if you're not state funded, I don't think they ought to do that. But Ed was a very strong-willed person with a lot of very, very strong opinions. And on occasions, I would clash with Ed, and other members of the board would clash with Ed. But Ed could tolerate it. I mean, we would have these discussions, and they would go on, and finally we would resolve it, or we would just take different positions. So I don't recall that, but it doesn't surprise me that Ed could make comments that way, and it doesn't surprise me that Brendan would react, and I think Brendan was absolutely right to react. My guess is that probably Boston retracted it, but I don't have an independent recollection of it.
Now as Governor Byrne nears the end of his second term, did you have discussions with him as to what his future plans were?
I remember chatting with Brendan, about that, but really just in very general terms. He said that he would hope that he could go on a couple of boards, which he did do. I remember kidding Brendan at one point that one of the things he really could do for me, if he wanted to do me a favor, was appoint me to the Prudential Board, because the Prudential Board paid something like $25,000 or $30,000 a year plus $3,000, $5,000 if you went to a meeting. And I remember he broke up laughing, and he said, "That's what I hope to do when I get out of here." But I teased him about it. I figured my chances of getting on the I have never been on a board that paid. I've never broken that skin yet. Anyway, so I remember talking about that, and whether he was going to go into private practice, or there were some opportunities, but they were general conversations.
Now, at some point, you decide to also move on from the Ford Foundation.
Right.
What year was that?
That was, I know you taxed my memory. I think that was about 1981. What happened was that McGeorge Bundy retires. He had been at Ford for about 20 years. And a fellow by the name of Frank Thomas comes in as president. I really liked McGeorge Bundy. I liked the people who were there. Frank Thomas comes in, it's a very different place. And Frank makes it clear that he wants to completely revamp the place. And so 45 people at Ford all leave in one time, which is known in the trade as the Mother's Day Massacre or something like that. So we all get a year's leave, or a year's leave of pay, etc., and time to do something else. And I had really begun to think that I would not want to stay at Ford, that it was going to be a very different place. And I had been there for a long time. And I think one of the problems with being in the philanthropic world is that after a while, it's very hard, as the old Rudyard Kipling poem, "If you can keep your head, all about you are losing there," very hard to maintain a fairly even keel. Because when you're giving out a lot of money, people treat you somewhat differently. You have a wisdom that people think you have, et cetera, and et cetera. And it was time to kind of change that. And the other problem with working in philanthropy, in my opinion, is that the longer you were there, the more of a generalist you become. Because you're looking to identify good people, you're looking to put money with good people, you're looking for good ideas, but you're not implementing it. You're not really going into depth about a particular issue, and what does it take to really get that issue done, and how are you going to go about doing it. And I thought that I was becoming more and more of a generalist, and it was probably time I was still young enough to do something else that would be challenging.
Okay.
So I left.
And left to go where?
Well, I got the idea, talking to a colleague of mine, Joel Handler, who was then at the a friend of mine who teaches at UCLA, Alan Handler's brother, and also talked a lot with Linda Stamato, who was on the Rutgers board with me at that time. And Linda was interested and had done some work and thinking about, she'd been involved in some labor stuff and interested in dispute resolution. And I had talked to Joel about that. And so I got the idea based on some of the things that I had done at Ford. Remember, I said we had begun, funding dispute resolution projects, and I had written a paper for the Ford board on setting up something called the National Institute for Dispute Resolution, which was a national institute that was going to deal with dispute resolution. So I decided that this was really the field I wanted to go into next. Or as McGeorge Blending once said to me, having helped created public interest law and clogged the courts with social policy stuff, now I wanted to do dispute resolution and take them all out of the courts. And we kind of laughed. Anyway, I thought this was an important new frontier. I thought it was an exciting development in law. I think it involved both law and a lot of other policy issues. And so I really wanted to get into that field. And so I went to speak to Bob McKay, who was then the dean of the NYU Law School, and very well known in legal circles. He had been chairman of the Attica Commission and so forth. And told Bob that I wanted to get into this field, that he had some thoughts, and he invited me to set up a project at the Institute for Judicial Administration at NYU. And then talked with some of my colleagues at Ford and was able to get a small Ford grant based on the merits, of course, on the way out. And with that money, set up the project for dispute resolution at NYU. And then hired Linda to come and help me on a kind of part-time basis. And then little by little began that center.
Mm-hmm. And at some point it moves its
yeah,
location.
At some point what happens, we're doing a lot of work with courts and with a lot of stuff on a national level. Through my contacts, I had known a lot of people in this world. And then the Hewlett Foundation in California decides that it'll make dispute resolution one of its priorities. And so I know the fellow who's the president and one of the guys who's the program officer, and they let it be known to me that they would fund a center that I could create. And I think about creating such a center. I had a small center, a bigger center at NYU. Joy had a conversation, and Hewlett had promised to make a fairly substantial grant, and I went to Ford, and they promised to make a substantial grant, and MacArthur Foundation, and I went to the dean of the. We were going to place the center in combination, the law school, plus the management school, the business school, and I went to see the dean, and Dean said, "Oh yes, that'd be a great idea. We're going to appoint a search committee for the chair, for the director." And I looked at him, I said, I'm raising all the money for this. I'm putting it, well, you may have a chance, I said, "Thank you very much." That was the end of my negotiation at NYU. And then I went and talked to Ed Blaustein, and Ed said that was something Rutgers would really be interested in. And why didn't I talk to Norman Samuels, who was then the provost at Newark, and I went with Linda to talk to Norman Samuels. Linda had gone with me to see Ed. And the three of us talked for a long time, and Norman said to us, "We'd be really happy to form the center at Rutgers, and we won't go initial search. You don't have to worry about that." And kiddingly, but you could understand. I came from New Jersey. I'm not going to do it. Anyway, so we formed the center at Greg's laughing. We formed the center at Rutgers in Newark, and stayed there for a number of years. And then an opportunity came. Mark Lapping, who was then appointed dean of the new public policy school, named after Ed Blaustein, and Mark offered us a opportunity to come to the public policy school, and at the same time offered us a faculty line. And that was really an extraordinarily good opportunity, and so that's how the center moved to New Brunswick.
Anything else you'd like to talk about as to the current sort of mission and initiatives of the center?
Well, Don, I know you want to. We want to talk with Bob Del Tufo for a few minutes about the chief. That would be another 8 hours, which I don't think either one of us want to go through, except to say that that's just been a tremendous opportunity that I have very much enjoyed, and I know my colleague has very much enjoyed it, and I think it's a most fascinating field. I mean, the opportunity to really think through how you can get people to make decisions that are more collaborative and that are based on consensus and less adversarial, and how you can train people in negotiation and et cetera to think differently about approaching a problem. I think that's really been very, very interesting and exciting. And in the last 10, 12 years, this field has grown astronomically. Today, there's not a law school in the country that doesn't teach dispute resolution. You couldn't go to a management school that didn't have 3 or 4 undergraduates do it. We do a lot of that. And same thing in public policy schools. And every court system in this country will have a dispute resolution program. There's a great private service of mediators, et cetera, and et cetera. And there are a lot of public policy decisions that are increasingly being made in this collaborative way. That's not to say that there's not an awful lot to be done. And there's a lot of research in this area, a lot of scholarship going in, trying to understand what is it that causes people to be adversarial and how you can get them to frame issues and think about working out their problems in a much more collaborative way. I find that really very interesting, really important stuff to do on a social policy level, and consider myself very lucky that I can sort of continue to do it. And I guess one last thing I'd say, how much I really enjoy teaching. And we teach a couple of courses in the Blaustein School on negotiation and public policy and how dispute resolution relates to that. And I find that to be a very special, exciting thing. I think dealing with students is really very special and very exciting. So I think if I'm going to end this interview on any way, I'd end it about talking about the values of teaching and how important I think they are, and the opportunity to get people to try to think of things differently, and the satisfaction that really comes to a teacher when on occasions students really get it, or 5 years later somebody will write you and say, you know, I thought about it and I think about this problem differently now. So I enjoyed that.